significant issues tonight in foreign affairs. And let me bring in now lawyer and analyst Mohamed El Rashidy. He joins me, and he will join us again after the debate. And former diplomat and Maclean's columnist Scott Gilmore joins us from New York. Good to have both of you on Everything is Political tonight. And Mohamed El Rashidy, I want to start with you because one of the big debates that has dominated foreign policy has been the debate about the niqab and this case where there was a woman who wanted to wear the niqab, the face covering, during her citizenship ceremony. The federal court overturned the government's decision to not let her wear it, not because they couldn't identify her. She was said she would lift the veil in private and identify herself. They just said it wasn't consistent with Canadian values, but now the government's challenging that. And now we've got the Syrian refugee policy. This seems to be working for Stephen Harper in Quebec. The other parties have accused him of fear-mongering. That will come up tonight. What's your take on how that has played out, Mohamed El Rashidy? Is this dog whistle politics or just a genuinely legitimate debate about Canadian values?
Well, thank you for having me, Evan. And you bring up very good points. It's not a legitimate debate as much as it is a dog whistle politics, as you're saying. And I'll tell you, first off, as a lawyer, it's very bothersome for lawyers to see legal procedures being used for political purposes. And so we're seeing our courts being used just simply so that politicians can score points. So that's sort of removing the individual rights and the civil liberties aspect here, and just looking at how we have our government going to court, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're going to surpass $300,000 just on this case, where we're telling a woman how to dress during a ceremony, and that in and of itself raises alarms for me.
But there's got to be more than just. I mean, I appreciate that. Sometimes there is the politicization of the legal system, but has this had any impact on the ground?
Oh, absolutely. It's had tremendous impact on the ground. I think when you see the discourse now, for starters, it has allowed the government to shape the discussion, and it has allowed it, as I've heard from your earlier speakers, talk about Harper's strengths, and this plays to them. You're framing the niqab debate as a foreign policy issue when we're talking about a woman in the Greater Toronto area, right? And so that should, in and of itself, shows you that Harper has won.
That is fascinating. That is a fascinating
point.
Point.
He's won it, right? That it's a foreigner thing. It's not a foreigner thing. It's a Canadian or somebody who wants to be a Canadian citizen. There are other Canadian citizens who've dealt with this. Now, the impact and the social impact that is very concerning is obviously that when you talk about dog whistle and that type of insinuation, is what you're doing is you're raising the rhetoric and you're increasing the level of hatred, the level of discrimination, all these kinds of things in relation to the targeted groups. Because people hear it from the top level of government, the Prime Minister, taking this kind of a stand where he's essentially saying, you're not Canadian, or you're not living our way of life. And that ends up causing a lot of distress to everything from children in schools who get bullied all the way up to people.
Well, I mean, the question is there I want to bring in Scott Gilmore, but the question is there real evidence of a correlation between, or even a causation, maybe more importantly, between this political decision and the experience of Canadians on the ground experiencing bullying? But Scott, I want to get you in here because you've written a lot about the refugee crisis and about the policy here. I mean, here we are having a debate about foreign policy for the first time in an election, and these are the fundamental issues that are at stake. Not necessarily trade with the U.S., trade with China. This stuff has become the kind of hot button issue. What do you make of that?
Well, you know what, I find it surprising. You're right. Foreign policy has not been an election topic for a long time, since the free trade election with Mulroney. And I'm not convinced that Canadians are really that concerned about some of the issues that are taking place outside the country. I think they're interested because of what's going to happen inside the country, or what they fear is going to happen. And so when Canadians talk about refugee policy, frankly, they don't give a damn about Syria. What they care about is there going to be a mosque on my street corner? Is this going to mean that I'm going to lose my job because of too many people here? And
sorry, you say they don't give a damn about Syria. Why is that? I mean, why do you say that? I mean, we have 6 CF-18 jets bombing there. This is supposed to be a fundamental security issue. There's a humanitarian crisis. Tell me, just unpack why you say they don't give a damn about it.
Canadians don't have to. They live, fortunately, in one of the safest and quietest corners of the globe. They're surrounded on one side by 10,000 kilometers of Pacific Ocean, then there's 6,000 kilometers of Atlantic Ocean, and then there's endless ice pack north of us. And to the south, we have the friendly, or at least we consider to be the friendly Americans. So Canadians, they really, foreign policy is not an issue that affects them on their day-to-day. Now, if you're in the United Kingdom, if you're in Australia, France, Germany, yes, this is something that's real. It's happening. People are crossing your borders. Russia is not that very far away. Shipping lanes are going right past your coasts. And so I think they pay a little bit more attention. We don't have to.
But I guess the question is, how is this playing? But we are paying attention in the sense that it's become a major issue. In your view, are these serious discussions about foreign policy, or, as you've written a bit about, Scott, has this been reduced to kind of, and Mohamed El Rashidy was saying this, sloganeering and dog whistle politics? It's not about the issue. It's about stoking fear and passions to galvanize a certain kind of voter base.
I think I agree with him. I think that there is a lot of dog whistle politics going on here. And I think it's because if you actually look at the foreign policy platforms of the three parties, they don't fit very well. These aren't platforms that actually are naturally strong planks for them. So, for example, take Harper. He's got to stand on that stage tonight and talk about foreign policy. Meanwhile, the Canadian Navy has been so badly neglected. It's not even a blue water Navy anymore. And we don't have the Keystone Pipeline, even though that's been the number one foreign policy priority for the government for, 4 or 5 years now? And then in Trudeau's case, he's got to stand on that stage and explain why he doesn't want to use force to protect Syrians, which is a fundamental component of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which the Liberals created themselves. And then there's Mulcair, with a mishmash of anti-trade views and protectionism and a strange NDP isolationism that is, hard to match with a more liberal or progressive view of the world that they pretend to have.
I mean, in the midst of all this, Mohamed El Rashidy, what issues? I mean, look, there's China. You got Xi Jinping in the States. You've got Putin in the States right now. You've got, the situation in Ukraine. You've got Syria. You got the refugee crisis. You've got the niqab issue, which you rightly point out is not a foreign policy issue, but it's certainly being lumped into that. And there's all sorts of other issues, free trade issues, the TPP issue that's being negotiated. Are any of these things sticky enough to change the course of this campaign?
Look, Evan, Scott's right on when he says Canadians don't have to worry about it. I agree with him. However, a master politician is able to transform perception into reality. So he creates the perception, and Harper is a master politician, that somehow the jihadists, in his own words, are knocking at our door. And he starts to create the danger, and that's how the Canadian public starts to care. I mean, look at this niqab debate. What are we talking about here? When you see Quebec overwhelmingly opposed to it, are we talking about a dozen women? Literally, a dozen, okay? Not even 100. Is that really a threat in any way? I mean, my goodness, if they were armed with tanks, they're not really a threat to an entire province. This is such an overblown thing. And so,
why is it overblown? That's the crack. I mean, you say it's having an impact. In your view, what is it?
Well, of course, why is it overblown? Because a politician sees an opportunity. It puts the NDP and the Liberals in a very difficult position because those are parties who have traditionally stood up for human rights and civil liberties. And they now have to answer particularly to Quebec, which has grown increasingly anti-Muslim. They've always been anti-religion there, but increasingly anti-Muslim. And then you have a divide. And we see that reflected in the polls, without a doubt. Thomas Mulcair is extremely uncomfortable in the lead in Quebec right now. And why is that? Because Stephen Harper played the niqab card. It's a masterful play that feeds into this Islamophobia and hatred of Muslims that's global, but increasingly so in Canada. And then you get into, I'll give you another example, the radicalization in mosques. I mean, that is absolutely not an issue in this country. The two attacks that we've had are two Québécois men, right? Martin Couture, Michel Bibot. These are they're radicalized online. RCMP, CSIS research have all made it clear that the main issue is online radicalization. You have a prime minister who's blaming it on mosques. or at least dog whistling that it's the mosques. Now, the mosques aren't a threat, and let's face it, the radicalization online is still, it's not something that's a threat to a great country like Canada. It's still lone wolf material. Our security services are doing a phenomenal job. So it isn't a big threat, but he's making it into a threat. And you ask why? Well, because the other portfolios are not going his way. The economy, which is traditionally his strength, are not going well. Employment is down. Unemployment is up. I can give you many examples. So he's playing to something that is working for him, and he's going to stay at it until, he's going to milk it as long as he can.
Scott Gilmore, I'm speaking to Mohamed El Rashidy and Scott Gilmore. Scott Gilmore, you're a former diplomat, and I should, by the way, just say Justin Trudeau has just arrived at the debate at the Roy Thompson Hall, and Stephen Harper is already there at the Roy Thompson Hall. The debate begins in about 23 minutes. But, Scott, a lot of the question will be Canada's place in the world. And I always wonder if this stuff connects. Now, we didn't get that seat on the UN Council, and we didn't, we pulled out of the treaty on desertification, and that might upset the Germans. And then as you say, we haven't invested in our Navy, and we haven't got those, we haven't replaced the CF-18s. We're extending the life for $400 million because of the debacle around the F-35. And then there's questions about our role as diplomats and Canada's role in the world as the peacemaker versus, Harper likes to say Canada used to be the go along to get along, and now we're going to take strong, principled stances. How has Canada's diplomatic position fundamentally, I'm not talking about rhetorically, but fundamentally changed under Harper, and does that become an issue?
Well, first of all, I prefer the term failed diplomat to former diplomat.
I don't want to characterize you, but that's kind of your red badge of courage. I know that.
That's right. Know me by the disasters that I've left behind in my wake. I think the question, there's this, it's almost an element of Canadian nationhood that we always think that we're in decline, that we always think that our position in the world is not what it used to be in the golden days. But when you go back and you actually look at, say, what we were saying in the 90s, it was the same thing. What we were saying in the 70s, even in the 60s and 50s, people were moaning the fact that Canada doesn't have its place in the world. So when you take a look at the numbers of what's happened to Canada between 2005, the last year of the Liberal government, and 2013, 2014, usually where the numbers end, our exports are up. Our foreign direct investment is up dramatically. Trade agreements are up 200% during the Harper period, the Conservative period. Defense spending is not as high as anybody wants it, but it's still up more than it was under the Liberals. Diplomatically, people complain that we're cutting our aid budget. In fact, we're spending more in aid now than we were in 2005. And then there's the people-to-people contacts. Canadians are traveling abroad more. We have more immigrants coming to Canada. We have more international students coming to Canada. And when it comes to our soft power, how people in the world see us, every year Canada ranks first and second in brand indexes, whether it's the Simon Anholt Nations brand, the Future brand, the BBC Global Scan brand index. We're 1 and 2. So I think it's very hard to say Canada is losing its place in the world, with one big exception, and that's I'm in New York right now. And it's UN week in New York. All of the leaders of the world descend here. All the diplomats are here. And I think you can say, it's difficult to measure, but you can say that Canadian diplomats have become much more reticent to engage. They've waited. They now wait for Ottawa to give them direction for everything. They're not pushing multilateral and bilaterally. They've sort of withdrawn into their shell, withdrawn into their embassies. Tough to measure that. But one definitely gets
the embassies that haven't been sold off. They're withdrawing into the embassies that haven't been sold off. All right. I know Mohamed El Rashidy is going to go and come back, and after the debate, and Scott Gilmore is going to leave us because he's in New York, and who knows what he gets up to there in New York. But let me ask a final question to both of you before you go. There's so many issues here, and Scott, you're in New York, where of course the issues of Obama and Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader there, cyber hacking and the Chinese economy and Chinese expansion into the South China Sea. Those are legitimate issues. The Pope was there talking about climate change, legitimate issues. Hillary Clinton rejects the Keystone XL pipeline. And of course, Putin, Obama shakes his hand and talked about engagement with Putin. Harper doesn't. Of all these issues, as we watch tonight and we wait, what do you expect to be the single kind of emerging issue or theme for each of these, or out of this debate, if there's one carry forward theme out of the foreign affairs debate, and I'll start with you, Scott, what do you think it will be tonight?
I think there's going to be a directed attack on Harper for eroding the mechanisms of power. They're going to argue that the aid budget isn't high enough, the defense budget isn't high enough. They're going to point out embassies have been sold, which, by the way, we actually have more embassies now than we did before, but that fact will go unnoticed. And I'm afraid that we're probably going to see a lot of sniping and not a lot of really interesting, deep conversations. But what do we expect? It's a debate. It's Canadian politics.
All right, Mohamed El Rashidy.
Evan, I'm really looking forward to the post-debate discussion. I take great exception to what you said about Canadian foreign policy being go along, fare along, and all of that. And that is what a master politician is trying to do, is to trying to denigrate its history, which is the pioneer of peacekeeping. And we can get into that more later. But to describe what Canada has done on the international stage, which has transformed the world on so many levels to the direction of peace, and to say that we were go along, what is he talking about? So those are important things. So what am I looking for? I'm looking for Stephen Harper trying to characterize Canada as a warrior nation. And that goes along with, we're bombing ISIS. Mind you, it's 4 jets out of 6 at any one time, in the dark, barely dropping any bombs because we're careful not to kill civilians, etc. He's going to emphasize that we're this warrior nation. I'm going to wait and see what the other 2 leaders are going to do about that. Are they going to let him control the discourse and try to catch up to his warrior nation concept, or are they going to actually stand up for what Canada has done historically and its stellar reputation around the world as peacekeeper? And that's not because we're weak, it's actually because we're strong.
It'll be interesting to see now that France has decided to bomb ISIS in Syria, how, and there's a socialist government, how Mulcair and Trudeau respond to that. We've got one of our producers, Yael Berger, has put up on our Facebook site some infographics on what does Canada spend on foreign aid. $4.97 billion in 2014. 4.97 represents about a 0.27% of Canada's GDP. Ethiopia, largest recipient of Canadian aid, with $186 million. Canada's spending on foreign assistance has dropped $500 million since 2013 and $800 million since 2011. So, at risk of getting some facts into a debate here, guys, I hate to do that. All right, Scott Gilmore, former diplomat. I'm not going to say you're a failed diplomat, Scott. Maybe you brought peace to the planet and everything screwed up when you left.
Yeah. Well, don't tell that to my former bosses.
Scott Gilmore, former diplomat, now columnist at Maclean's Magazine, and Mohamed El Rashidy, lawyer and analyst, will join us after the debate for some post-debate analysis alongside Ambassador Jeremy Kinsman. Lots to come, gents. Thanks so much for being on Everything is Political. Enjoy yourselves tonight.